I would love for you to imagine a time when your autistic child was having a meltdown or experiencing sensory overload. If you're anything like me, you probably felt helpless because you were unable to actually comfort your child. My name is Bethany, and I know this feeling all too well. This is my son and his service dog, Cosmo. My son was diagnosed with autism when he was 7 years old. There were so many times that I felt powerless, just watching him suffer without being able to comfort him. This feeling led me to researching service dogs, hoping to find a solution. And as I went deeper into my research, I came across countless stories like ours. I read how these children were thriving with the help of a service dog, and this brought me to tears. I read about children who began to speak. I read about a child who was found by a dog after they eloped. And I also came across something called deep pressure therapy and how a dog can comfort an autistic child during a meltdown. So this actually gave me some hope. And I was convinced that this was what we had to do. And so I got to work. This picture shows our son on vacation, reading a book in a bookstore 2 years after Cosmo became a part of our family. Before Cosmo, we rarely ventured outside of the house. It was extremely stressful for me to try to venture out without my husband and try to manage my son in public. And we all felt trapped. We felt overwhelmed. But with the help of Cosmo, we actually were able to break free from our isolation and start exploring the world around us. When I started researching service dogs, I quickly realized that this wasn't as easy as ordering something off of Amazon. The first thing I discovered was that service dogs were for those with disabilities. So I quickly Googled, is autism a disability? Obviously, the answer was yes. And while this was the answer, I thought, to all of our problems, it actually became a much bigger issue obtaining a service dog. So after discovering many autism service dog organizations, they have year-long waits and super high expenses. I almost gave up. You see, typically, families have the time to wait and raise funds, especially if their child is younger and are not quite at the age requirements. So despite these obstacles, I pressed on because I was determined to explore all avenues for my son's benefit. When we first discovered our son's severe ADHD, general anxiety disorder, and sensory processing disorder, we thought that we had identified the root of his behavioral issues. However, after we began treating his ADHD with therapy and medication, it became clear that there was more at play. Despite being told that it was just a phase and that boys develop at different rates, we persisted and sought evaluations from multiple specialists. Unfortunately, each one seemed to have a different explanation for our son's behavior, blaming anything from our parenting skills to homeschooling. In one particular experience, a specialist dismissed our concerns only after 15 minutes of observation. I left feeling defeated, and I cried because I had just watched my son count chairs in his waiting room for 45 minutes while we waited on him. He counted those chairs by ones and twos and threes. He counted them by fives. He counted them backwards, and he counted them in slow motion, and he counted them in supersonic mode. I was so distraught over a person who could say that my son did not have autism after only being with him for 15 minutes. We eventually found a great and wonderful, dear doctor who spent the time and got to know our son and finally diagnosed him actually on the spectrum. We learned an important lesson about advocating for our child and never settling for less than just the care that he needs and the care that he actually deserves. So after our son was finally diagnosed on the spectrum, I began to immediately set up all the therapies and I continued the research of autism service dogs. Initially, a Google search would lead me to pages that claimed official certification for service dogs, but actually, there's no nationally or legally recognized standards for service dog training, certification, or identification. This means that professionals, trainers, organizations, and owners may train service dogs. The ADA allows people with disabilities to train their own dogs and are not required to use a professional service dog training program. So given our circumstances, I decided that I was going to take on this task of training our own service dog. I was going to save the money and do it all myself. However, homeschooling and taking care of our 3 children and our autistic son proved to be a much bigger challenge than I expected. So I kept researching, and I discovered a breeder who generously donated Cosmo to our family. He then led me to a small trainer with a nonprofit organization who actually had immediate openings for service dog training. So we spent a year raising Cosmo with basic obedience training, and then we sent him off for several weeks for specialized training. When he returned, our lives were forever changed. According to the American with Disabilities Act, a service dog is an animal defined as a dog that has been individually trained to do the work or perform tasks for an individual with a disability. The task performed by the dog must be directly related to that person's disability. So what does this mean? What kind of task does an autism service dog do? So remember that story I asked you to think about at the beginning? Well, here's our story. Our son's meltdowns would last for hours, and I literally mean hours. They left us feeling helpless, and we tried everything from setting up a calm down corner and calm down boxes. We tried to bargain with him, we tried punishing, and we even tried crying ourselves. But nothing actually worked. And then after a meltdown, it would take us hours to just recover. All of us needed time to recover. And so when I started this research, I actually discovered something called deep pressure therapy. This is what an autism service dog does for a child on the spectrum. Basically, they are taught to cover the child during a meltdown. It's kind of like a weighted furry blanket. So the first time we tried Cosmo during a meltdown, we watched our little boy able to relax and calm down within 5 minutes. And it was like a miracle. Like, I literally broke down in tears as I watched our son be able to come out of this meltdown that usually took him hours to get out of. And then he just went about his day. It was beautiful. So our little furry friend has actually also been trained to identify and interrupt our son's meltdowns before they actually occur. So Cosmo has become so sensitive to our son's behavior that he knows when to start licking his face and then pawing at him to prevent a meltdown from happening. This has been an essential tool in our toolbox, and it has significantly reduced the number of meltdowns our son experiences. At first, Cosmo recognized physical triggers like heavy breathing, hands on face, and even a slightly elevated voice tone. But now he's become so tuned to our son's needs that he actually can identify internal triggers and respond to our son even when we're not present. During my husband's PhD studies, our family actually lived on a seminary campus in Kentucky. And one sunny day, we walked up to get our mail and planned to have lunch with my husband in his office, but his office was actually on the other side of campus. I went to go get my mail, and I turned around, and our son had actually disappeared. At first, I actually didn't panic because he often wandered, but usually he never wandered out of my sight. And so I started searching, and he was nowhere to be found. As time went on, anxiety filled my body as I realized that he had actually eloped. and it was one of my biggest fears in raising him. Eventually, we found him curled up on some steps to his dad's office, covering his ears, rocking back and forth, and I hugged him tightly and cried with him until he was able to calm down. Eloping is a common fear for parents with autistic children. Our children have no sense of danger, and they have poor executive functioning skills. So to prepare for situations like this, Cosmo has actually been trained for search and rescue. We've actually never had to use this particular task in public, but we often practice it at home and in public places. You can actually check out a demonstration of this on our Instagram page. So one of the reasons we welcomed Cosmo into our home was so that I could run errands with our son and keep a watchful eye on him in public. Cosmo is much like a furry anchor. His vest has a handle that our son can use to stay close to us. Many autism service dogs are actually trained in what we call tethering. Tethering is where a dog is tethered to the child, and if a child begins to run off, the dog is actually trained to then sit down, and it keeps that child from eloping. Cosmo's vest actually helps our son stay focused and remain by our side when we are in public. Did you know that petting a dog increases oxytocin in your body? Oxytocin decreases anxiety and actually increases pain tolerance, which is essential in kids with autism. So there was a time when our pediatrician wanted to send our son to go get tests run. One was an x-ray, another was a CT. And so I had spent some time preparing him for this appointment. But upon seeing that equipment, our son quickly went into a meltdown, and it took me about 35 minutes to get him back into the car. It wasn't until we welcomed Cosmo into our home did our son actually be able to manage his anxiety and then go to these tests and receive the necessary medical attention that he needed. So Cosmo provides our son with sensory input, and a quick little tummy rub or a snuggle can actually help reduce his stress levels. Parents of children on the spectrum often worry about their children being bullied or maybe not even having friends. So the first time we actually took Cosmo to a park with us, I was overwhelmed with joy because I watched children approach my son and ask about Cosmo. This actually prompted my son to tell them what autism was and how Cosmo helped him. This is what we call a social bridge. That's what Cosmo has become for him. Having a dog who attracts attention actually helps our son practice his social skills and learn self-advocacy. Cosmo has been an answer to so many prayers. Who doesn't want to be friends with the only kid in the room with a dog? So if you're wondering whether a service dog would be a good fit for your family, there's some few things that you should consider. First, does your child like dogs or animals? If the answer is no, then you should probably consider waiting and possibly getting an emotional support animal in the future. We'll talk about a little bit more about those emotional support animals here in a bit. Second, you need to ask yourself if your family's prepared to take on the long-term commitment and expense of having a service dog. Many service dogs actually require more grooming than your average pet does, and obviously you're going to have those vet bills that come along. Third, are you comfortable handling a dog while simultaneously taking care of your autistic child? This can be a challenge even with a highly trained service dog. The dog will be looking to you, the adult, for guidance and commands at all times. However, your child also may be requiring your undivided attention. This can be quite taxing, especially if you have more than one child and you decide to add a third kid to your family in your 40s, like we did. Yeah, that was a lot for us all to take on a service dog and have another baby all at the same time. When you have a service dog for a child, this is called a trio team. So a trio team is unique in that the dog actually learns to take commands from both sets of parents. And then as the child gets older, they can begin to take on the role of the full-time handler. And so our son is actually making progress in this right now. And eventually he will become the full-time handler of Cosmo. So let's discuss this emotional support animal. What are they? If you think your child would actually benefit from having a dog, but you kind of have some worries and concerns about taking on the full-time service dog, there are some solutions that you can consider. An emotional support animal, it's called an ESA, maybe something you want to consider. They're essentially just pets, but they actually are prescribed by a licensed mental health professional. It's important to note, though, that these dogs actually do not have the same public access rights as service dogs do. So you are not going to be able to take these into a public setting. However, the Fair Housing Act considers ESAs to be assistant animals. So this means that people cannot be discriminated against when obtaining housing due to a disability. So rules such as pet bans or restrictions are waived for individuals who have a prescription for an ESA. And they actually cannot be charged a pet deposit either. So an ESA is an excellent option for those who want to consider having a dog but don't want the commitment of a service dog. If you're wondering how to begin the process, you are going to consider a few things. What is your budget and how much time do you have? The next step would be to begin researching different organizations or researching your area for highly respected trainers who either will help you train a service dog or will take on the training of a service dog full time. Also, too, you want to look into grants and scholarships. Many organizations provide these options for you, and those are definitely worth investigating. If this seems daunting, don't worry. You can actually download our free guide to getting a service dog, or you can hire our team for a small fee. We've actually researched the top 10 organizations and can assist you in applying for a service dog. We can point you to scholarships and grants. We can help you do research in your area for a good trainer, and we can also help set up a fundraising campaign. So if you'd like more information on any of these things, you can email us at cosmoandhisboy@gmail.com, or you can find us on cosmoandhisboy.com. Thanks for listening.